Hello and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video. Today I'm going to talk to you about persecution and this really common Christian claim that Christians are the most persecuted group or religious group in the world. You hear it so often, particularly from obviously Christians, most often referring to Christian media sources who will report raw data or work done by people like Pew Research Center and interpret it in such a way to make the conclusion that Christians are the most persecuted, to have some kind of martyrdom medal, just so we can feel sorry for them. What I'm not going to do is minimize Christian persecution. It does happen. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. It happens around the world in very many societies, okay, and it can be, pretty awful, or end in death, which is about as awful as you can get. So it happens, but there needs to be a heck of a lot of nuance in talking about it, and we need to consider atheism as a group as well. So there are these two assumptions that I have. One, that atheism is and atheists are a religious group. For categorization purposes, we talk about Muslims, Christians, other religions, atheists, when we're talking about religious persecution. And the other assumption is oppressed, attacked, all these kind of words mean the same thing as persecution. So my conclusion, to start with that, is that this term, most persecuted, is too simplistic to be able to engender a straightforward answer, given that it's a really complex area belying a nuanced understanding of what it is that's being talked about. Okay, what's more, atheists as a group, and in some meaningful way, I suppose, are not being adequately considered in most persecuted religious group terminology and research. And that's really, really, really important, because it kind of invalidates all the research, or not, it doesn't invalidate the research, it invalidates the conclusions that many people draw from the research. In fact, my main conclusion is that this whole discussion of who is the most persecuted is essentially pointless. So, there you go. We could start with a bunch of questions. What does persecution mean? Does this take into account, in any meaningful way, different types of persecution, from the death penalty to general harassment? Who must be responsible for the persecution? Is it governments or states, religious organisations, other organisations, the general public, whatever? How is it measured? Is it reliable, the data? Are certain groups largely missing from the data? And we could also ask, can one group be most persecuted in one sense, but a different group most persecuted in another sense? And hopefully I'll deal with all of those sort of questions. But, you can imagine more questions coming out of that. You could say it's like saying white people are the most violent in the world. What does this mean? Does this take into account white people in majority black countries, majority white countries, in terms of domestic abuse, or in terms of war, in terms of both? The point being that making huge generalized claims is a pretty silly pastime, and it needs a whole lot more explanation to be useful to anyone. As ever, we need to start with a definition, and I'm just going to read you a simple Wikipedia definition as to what persecution is. Quote, religious persecution is defined as violence or discrimination against religious minorities. Actions which are intended to deprive minorities of political rights and force them to assimilate, leave, or live as second-class citizens. In the aspect of a state's policy, it may be defined as violations of freedom of thought, conscience, and belief which are spread in accordance with a systematic and active state policy which encourages actions such as harassment, intimidation, and the imposition of punishments in order to infringe or threaten the target minority's right to life, integrity, or liberty. The distinction between religious persecution and religious intolerance lies in the fact that in most cases the latter is motivated by the sentiment of the population, which may be tolerated or encouraged by the state. The denial of people's civil rights on the basis of their religion is most often described as religious discrimination rather than religious persecution. Examples of persecution include the confiscation or destruction of property, incitement of hatred, arrests, imprisonment, beatings, torture, murder, and executions. Religious persecution can be considered the opposite of freedom of religion. And I'll go with that definition for the sake of expediency, but already this is a definition that takes into account a plurality of types and methods of persecution, all which contain a different sort of weighting. So is it more important, I suppose, or is there more value attached to dying as a result of persecution, or some other kind of lack of civil liberty? So that different weighting of seriousness is very important. This, which I'll explain, represents a huge problem in terms of comparing countries that have different populations and prevalence for different types of persecution. So an analogy might be, who buys the most stuff? A person who buys a bag of 100 nuts for $2, or someone who buys a single car for $100,000? Definitions are so important here. And concerning the data itself at source, there are different areas of persecution, from laws and ruling governments to nationalist parties to organisations to cultural norms to general people. So this is a very complex area, and to give a blithe statement that, for example, Christians are the most persecuted group in the world is a massive simplification of a very complex area. So, our initial problems. Atheists. The first and obvious obstacle that we come across, which will then massively affect collecting data, is that atheists are too afraid to admit they are atheists, right? I interviewed Iranian atheist Kaveh Masabi on this YouTube channel, who's a fellow blogger at Pathos Non-Religious, and I had to blur him out of the video for fear of death or reprisals on account of his beliefs and claims. And yet currently there are at least 600 churches and 500,000 to 1 million Christians in Iran operating above board. In Iran, atheism is officially unrecognized. In other words, you can't officially be an atheist. You can't admit it. Iran is one of 13 countries where atheism is punishable by death. And I'm not aware of any country where Christians are officially punished with death for their belief. That's not to say they aren't themselves punished in some way, or even killed for some reason by someone in general terms of persecution, but this is about state-sanctioned punishment. What does this mean for both persecution and data collection? Well, it simply means there will be no real data that is usable to put this question to bed. Atheists can't even admit their belief for them to be persecuted as atheists. In other words, their persecution invalidates their own persecution from being admitted and recorded. Whoa, so we have a big data collection problem here. Furthermore, atheists don't live in communities, and they will not admit atheism in such countries. By communities, I mean like a whole village of, say, atheists, or a whole family social network of atheists. This means that a Christian who is born into a minority community will be born into a community that does in some places suffer real and open persecution all of their lives. How do you compare this in any sensible way to an atheist who can't even admit their atheism because they will be killed, and so pretends to be Muslim, for example? The case of Mohsen Amir Aslani, who was convicted for making innovations in religion and was executed in Iran. I mean, how do you, in terms of data, compare two people, him and a Christian, the atheist and a Christian, when one person is killed or executed or threatened with it, was executed, and say another person was persecuted in a non-fatal way, how do you compare those things? Who is the most persecuted? Well, you would assume the person who's executed. Well, what about if a family of 5 who were openly Christian were persecuted and one atheist who was found out to be atheist was killed? Is that worth more than these 5? And we'll come on to that. The atheist won't experience persecution because, due to persecution, they have to pretend to be the majority in-group identity of Muslim. The few who get found out die. The Christian, who doesn't really get to do this, suffers persecution. And the data looks like Christians suffer way more instances of persecution in Iran, for example. Not only this, but how many non-violent persecutions are worth one Amir Aslani, as I said before? How do we equitably record and measure such different instantiations of persecutions? We could stop the conversation here, right now, stop the video now, for 2 reasons. 1. On state-sanctioned official persecutions, atheists fare worse than any other group, if this was our metric. 2. All data is so problematic that meaningful conclusions and claims are pointless. And actually, effectively, I would end the video here and the case here, but I will go on. The one piece of data I was eventually provided was from a Church Times piece in the last argument I had about this. And the Church Times piece was called "Christians are the most persecuted religious group in the world," says Pew Report. That is, the article in question was a very small article with a massive conclusion. And then that gets spread around, and then this whole myth is perpetuated. I'm going to read you half the article here, because this is how small the article was. Quote, "Christians remain the most persecuted religious group in the world, new figures from the Pew Research Centre show. The Centre's report on religious harassment in 2016 found that Christians were harassed in 144 countries, up from 128 the year before, while Muslims were harassed in 142 countries, up from 125 in 2015. I'll interject here that quote. So the metric of most harassed is literally the number of countries they are harassed in. That is the metric. Continue the quote. "Published last week, the report says Christians and Muslims have typically been harassed in the largest number of countries around the world. These 2 groups are the largest religious groups in the world and have substantial populations in more countries than other smaller and less geographically dispersed religious groups. There was a real jump in the number of countries where Jews were harassed in 2016, following a small decrease in 2015. That's half the article. So you can see this is a really simplistic analysis. This is basically the most countries, really, is harassing the most countries, end of. And then there's a little nod to the fact that these are populous countries, and so we're talking in terms of real numbers. Real numbers of Christians, as opposed to, for example, proportions and so on, which I'll come to talk about. So how do we slice and dice the data? So hopefully lots of you already will have noticed that we have classic issues over the term most. Does this mean in terms of real numbers, proportion, or type? So we could have many different scenarios. And I'm going to list you some scenarios which have very different conclusions. 1. Group A has a worldwide population of 2 billion. Group B, 100,000. They are each persecuted at the same rates proportionally. Group A is claimed to have a greater persecution because of higher real numbers. 2. Group A has a worldwide population of 2 billion. Group B has 100,000. Group A is persecuted at 1% and B at 30 times greater rate of 30%. Group A is claimed to have a greater persecution because of higher real numbers, even though they have a far smaller proportion of those in their population being persecuted. In other words, you are far more likely to be persecuted if you're in Group B, but A is deemed as more persecuted. Number 3, Group A has a worldwide population 2 billion, Group B 100,000. Group A is persecuted at 1% and Group B at 30 times greater rate of 30%. Group B is claimed to have a greater persecution because of higher proportion, percentage chance of persecution, as I said. 4. Group A has a worldwide population 2 billion, Group B 100,000. Group A is persecuted with Action X at 1% and Group B at 5% for less violent harassment. But Group B records a higher proportion persecution for deaths. Action Y at 2 to 1. Group A is claimed to have greater persecution because of a higher real number in total cases. So adding deaths and less harassment, they have greater persecution. But then you can have number 5, the same as the above, but Group B is seen to have greater persecutions due to the seriousness and greater chance of Action Y, the death. So if you give death a greater weighting, worth a lot more harassment than much lower types of harassment, you get different conclusions. So on and so forth. You can make up all sorts of different combinations here. But you start to see the problems with such a facile statement as the original one, Christians are the most persecuted. All the while, atheists don't even get recorded because they can't even admit or report persecution because it's illegal or culturally forbidden to admit atheism. Looking at the source data, as ever, at Pew Research Centre, which would be a sensible thing for the Church Times to do in a lot greater depth, and I'm only picking the Church Times randomly, there's loads of different media outlets who do the same thing. We can see a plurality of metrics that invalidate the claims of people such as the Church Times. And I'll just give you one quick quote from the Pew Research Centre. Quote, overall, Muslims were the most common target of harassment by nationalist political parties or officials in 2016, typically in the form of derogatory statements or adverse policies. This was the case in Denmark, where the Danish People's Party, DPP, backed a measure passed by the City Council in Randers that made traditional meals, including pork products, mandatory in public institutions, including schools. So on and so forth. Because Muslims traditionally do not eat pork. So that quote shows that on the metric of nationalist political parties, Muslims are the most harassed. Outside of government or national opposition political parties, this was also the case with nationalist organisations who targeted religious minorities as well, where Muslims again fared the worst. And I'll give you another quote. In European countries, Muslims were targeted most frequently. Muslims were the focus of nationalist groups in 20 of the 25 European countries where these types of groups were active. Following the terrorist attack in Brussels in March 2016, for example, the Spanish nationalist group Madrid Social Home hung signs near a major mosque in Madrid reading, quote, today Brussels, tomorrow Madrid, ? And posted, quote, mosques out of Europe, close quote, on Twitter. But while Muslims were the primary target of nationalist movements across the globe, and it goes on to talk about the fact that there are different metrics. So if you're talking about nationalist movements and organisations, then Muslims are the most harassed in the world. So you could use one of those metrics, both those metrics together, or completely different metrics. How do you add up these different pieces of data? How do you slice and dice it? And it looks very much like the Church Times, for example, cherry pick their data. So we need to apply some nuance. I mean, even if you look at trends, Europe and America is seeing levels of hostility involving religion increase the most. So actually Europe and America, where we see Muslims being persecuted more, having an increase in religious persecution, whereas other groups in the Middle East are actually getting less persecution. And that's according to the Pew data. Again, this doesn't really look like the narrative that is being claimed by, for example, the Church Times and the people I argue against. And I cannot stress this enough. The type of harassment makes a massive difference. So take China, where state restrictions may officially but rather lightly affect Christians, and this concerns a massive population, but it also includes huge disparities in type of harassment, as Uyghurs, who are Muslims, are detained in concentration camps. So China's a great example where you get Chinese Christians persecuted to a much different degree than Uyghur Muslims, who are being put sterilized. Females are being sterilized, and the men are being blindfolded and put on trains to concentration camps, which is kind of Holocaust. Then again, it gets even more complicated because the Hui Muslims in China are not given as much persecution as the Uyghur Muslims. So is that then not religious and actually cultural and racial because of the difference between these two ethnicities? It's really, really complicated and actually requires a lot more nuance. And I will read you another little bit from the Pew as well. Quote, "It is important to note, however, that these restrictions and hostilities do not necessarily affect the religious groups and citizens of these countries equally, as certain groups or individuals, especially religious minorities, may be targeted more frequently by these policies and actions than others. Thus, the actual proportion of the world's population that is affected by high levels of religious restrictions may be considerably lower than the 85%. That they had previously given, right? So the Pew are admitting nuance here, that things differ from across geography and in the types of persecution. So just adding up persecution and seeing the most populous group or the most countries where these groups live, and then saying they are the most persecuted group might in some sense be technically correct, but is woefully inadequate and I would say at best incoherent. You know, if you are going to say are the most persecuted, you need to really establish how you are creating that number and establish that is the best sense of most persecuted, whilst also admitting the nuances and the lack of data and all sorts of other issues. What's most important possibly to mention in this context, though, is that Pew data doesn't even mention anywhere, not once, non-religious people. They are utterly absent from the report analysis. So that's thoroughly problematic, and it's lucky that the international humanist groups like the IHEU, on the other hand, produce reports annually, such as the Freedom of Thought report. And that details the best and worst countries in which to be an atheist, clearly laying out their ranking system. So they at least look at the problem of admitting persecution, the problem that atheists suffer in the world, and they lay out a very clear ranking system on where the best and the worst places to be an atheist are. One argument that's often given is that where you get these, Christian genocides. Actually, technically speaking and legally speaking, even in international jurisprudence, genocide is not the same as persecution. I don't want to bog this video down with that. I'll put a link to my original article on this where you can have a little look at that. So I don't want to start going down the whole genocide route. We have a different calculation. Does one instance of genocide, which could arguably at times be defined as cultural tribalism, count as persecution, or does it get counted as many times as there are deaths? So when you're looking at I talk a little bit about this. When you look at Boko Haram supposedly having a genocide against Nigerian Christians at the moment, so this is one claim that you hear quite often. Now, these Christians are being certainly persecuted or oppressed or on the verge of there being a genocide. Question is it because they're Christian or is it because they are non-Muslim? So in fact, I would argue it's not. So if you had a community of atheists, they'd actually be treated worse than the Christians, right? So essentially, the target group happens to be Christian, but their label is non-religious, or sorry, non-Muslim. They are being attacked not because they're Christian per se, but because they are non-Muslim. And they are being attacked in this exactly the same way, or possibly not even as seriously as, say, an atheist would. And this then gets you another level of difficulty. I mean, in Nigeria, where you can get locked up for being an atheist, you can get executed for being an atheist. You have people not admitting their atheism, so you can't tell how many atheists there are. And you have Muslims attacking Christians on account of their lack of not being, or their lack of being a Muslim. You get them being attacked, but you don't know how many atheists there are, and this confuses the whole system of recording the data and analysing it thereafter. I think the non-Muslim Christian difference may sound semantic, but I think it's really, really important for understanding what's going on. And actually, if you look at Muslim holy books, you'd rather be a Christian than an atheist. Because, the Hadith and the Quran, they don't treat atheists well at all. So there you go. But I won't talk about genocide anymore, other than it's slightly different, and again, it's a nuanced area. A few similar quotes I'm going to give you from Hemant Mehta on the Friendly Atheist blog, who has written also about this, and he says that such claims from like the Church Times and other places are both technically accurate in some sense, like I said before, but utterly misleading. And he says for some of the reasons are these two. One, harassment literally includes anything. Verbal hate to government oppression. So we don't know if the incidents reported in those 143 countries were, say, more life-threatening than whatever Muslims faced. Two, Christians and Muslims represent the two largest religious groups in the world, so of course the number of countries in which they reported harassment is going to be higher. It's not necessarily because they're hated more, it's because there's a lot of them all over the world. So again, similar issues to what I was pointing out. It's again, real-term numbers, proportionality, and the weighting of different subsets of harassment and persecution. So this is about being intellectually rigorous. As an anecdote, by the way, some time ago I published a book, an edited book of deconversion accounts called Beyond an Absence of Faith. And because this was about deconverting from Christianity and Islam mainly to atheism, and because atheism is persecuted from the US to Iran, a number of contributors wrote under pseudonyms, and this includes from the US, for crying out loud. So I wonder how many Christians around the world can't even give their real names for fear of reprimand, either systemically or locally. For atheists, this is surprisingly globally common. I've produced writings here at my blog from Indonesia, from parts of Africa, and they have to be done as pseudonyms because they fear reprimand. They fear persecution. And that's just an anecdote, admittedly, but I think it's asking whether this would be the case for Christians around the world, or Muslims, or anyone else. So to conclude, I think it's obvious that anyone claiming X are the most persecuted is either being disingenuous and willfully ignorant, or just plain ignorant. And I mean that both pejoratively and non-pejoratively. I mean, some people are ignorant because they kind of choose to be or aren't interested in finding out the truth, and some people just don't know the truth. Someone who's very well read and intelligent should be tasking themselves with making sure that claims that they make are really well defended and robustly coherent. So if you are making a claim that Christians are the most persecuted group of people in the world, you need to be making sure you can back that up really, really well. And I actually think it's impossible to do so because I think most persecuted is incoherent. I would say that neither Christians nor atheists nor Muslims are the most persecuted. The statement X are the most persecuted is coherent unless completely and utterly qualified with a heck of a lot of detail. So what I will say is 1. If I were to choose any religious group to be an open and public member of, using John Rawls' veil of ignorance, not knowing where I would be placed in the world, atheism would be my last choice if I was only concerned with safety. I would challenge anyone who thinks Christians are the most persecuted to answer this. Like, what would they choose to live at as if they didn't know where they were going to live? 2. That the out-group is the most persecuted, and enshrining universal and equitable morality into law to protect all minority groups in the world, in every country, is what we should be arguing for, not for who can claim the best martyrdom for some kind of poor me medal of who is the most persecuted. This is about, almost invariably, the in-group and the out-group. The in-group in power and the out-group disenfranchised and lacking in civil rights. So, there you have it. The most persecuted in the world, don't bother trying to claim one or the other. But if you do, you've got to recognise that atheists don't even figure in the data because of the nature of the persecution of atheists. And the fact that they are threatened with execution in something like 13 countries of the world because of their beliefs, which is way more than any other religious group. Now, of course, it's way more complex than just that metric. So don't go saying blithe statements like Christians are the most persecuted. Here endeth the lesson. Check out my blog at A Tippling Philosopher and see you soon.